Hi, Mamie. Welcome to the show.
Hi, it's so nice to be here today.
I want you to tell everyone who you are and what you do, and also your podcast in case they're not familiar.
Sure. I'll start with that, which is I'm the host of the Modern Manager podcast, and I do a whole bunch of stuff through the podcast and other content and workshops to help managers be effective team leaders. And then I have another business called Meteor, where I help teams and managers lead effective meetings and build strong, healthy cultures of meetings within their organizations.
Yeah, and just so everyone knows, I actually found Mamie by listening to your podcast because it's one of those. I think when you become a manager, and we've talked about this on the show a lot, you're just sort of thrown into it, and you're always looking for advice on things that are very applicable to you. I think the best thing you can do is find people in real life, but sometimes you're not comfortable talking to them. You talk about all that kind of stuff on your podcast, which is how I found it. So really great resource, especially for people who are maybe new managers and kind of navigating those waters for the first time. But we're actually talking about a topic that is whether you're a manager or not, you probably come in contact with bad meetings at work. So maybe share maybe some data or stats about what is currently going on with meetings at work, besides the fact that they make for a great meme on Instagram.
Oh my gosh. So, as you might imagine, the pandemic was not helpful when it came to our meeting practices. Right before the pandemic, we already knew that meetings were a huge waste of time. Most organizations cited meetings as one of the biggest time and productivity wasters in their organizations, right? You talk to employees and like everyone has a story about how terrible their meetings are. And then the pandemic, we all moved virtual, and that exacerbated some of the problems in some ways because now we were doing everything online and we were missing out on all the good benefits of meetings, the relational stuff that came through. And those trends have really carried forward. Meetings are still considered a waste of time. Most people attend somewhere between 4 and 12 hours a week in meetings. That's
Wow.
a lot of time. And like
Yes.
somewhere around a third of those are considered to be a waste of time and useless. And Zoom meetings, we have Zoom fatigue that has really
Yeah.
settled in that we have not quite solved for. So I could just go on and on and on, but it's really everyone, I don't even have to explain it because people just live it. They know what it's like to be in a bad meeting and how many of those they have to sit through every single week.
Absolutely. I think you recognize when you're the one sitting in a bad meeting, but I think there's also now this like extra pressure for you to be the one who runs a good meeting if you're going to ask everybody to come together too. And this is one of those topics, kind of like a la management, where you're never really taught like how to run a good meeting, how to make it effective.
Exactly.
I think the tips have been kind of circulating since because to your point, the pandemic really highlighted this like terrible meeting culture that we are all sort of obsessed with. Before we get into some tips on how to run a better meeting, I want to talk about why they're currently so unproductive. So, like, what are some of the characteristics of bad meetings currently?
Well, the reason they're so unproductive in general is exactly what you just said, which is we are not taught how to run meetings. It is actually a craft and it's a skill. And we just assume, well, you have been in other people's meetings and therefore you know how to lead it. The other thing I want to point out is that historically, when I've talked to managers or anyone really, they always tell me a story about someone else's meeting, right? We know what it's like to sit in a bad meeting. But when we're the one leading it, we often don't realize how bad it is for people because it's serving our needs, or it's meeting our needs, or we wouldn't have led it that way. But it's not meeting the needs of our participants. So it's just an important nuance to now realize that, oh, even if you think you're running good meetings, you should probably check in with your team and find out about that because it
Yeah.
may not feel that way to them. Okay. So then why are we actually having all these bad meetings? Well, you've heard we've all kind of said like, oh, meetings that don't have a clear purpose, right? Which is true. But again, a lot of people think that they do have a clear purpose. So like, well, yeah, this meeting is to discuss the client problem. A discussion is not a reason to have a meeting. It's the activity that you do in the meeting. So this gets into some of the nuance that people struggle with is because the tips that are going around to help people have better meetings don't actually tell you what to do. It's kind of generic advice. Have an agenda. That's great, but like how do you actually build an agenda that gets you to the outcome you're looking for and is engaging for folks? That's a whole different thing than just saying, I wrote down that we're going to discuss this document and we're going to have this materials presented and now we're good. We got an agenda. It's not the same thing.
No, there's an agenda and then there's like an agenda, and
Yes.
yes, to your point, like there's a lot of generic advice out there. And this is why we have you on the show and we're not just, going to the internet to answer our questions. So, okay, tell us, what are the specific characteristics of running a good meeting? Maybe we should start with like, how do you know if you need to have an in-person meeting, kind of use that sync time, or you don't need to. So tell us kind of the reasons to meet in person.
Well, there's reasons to meet in general, and then there's reasons that you shouldn't be meeting. So I just want to start with that first, which is you should not be meeting just to share information, unless that information is highly sensitive or really complex, where you really need to make sure that you're checking for understanding as you go. Or again, if it's sensitive and you really want to be really respectful to the person, right? You don't want to send something in an email that they could misinterpret or could be hurtful. So you really want to just sit with them and talk to people. In terms of in-person, right? Well, some teams can't have in-person meetings because they're not co-located. And so you can have any meeting as a virtual meeting. If you have the option of having an in-person meeting, then the things you want to do are really around bringing people together to build the relationship. So when do those relationships matter in a meeting? Right? If you're making a tough decision, that might be a reason to bring people in. If it's a celebratory moment, that might be a reason to bring people in. But again, there are also a lot of good reasons to do things over virtual meetings. A lot of technology that is just easier to use when you're in a virtual setting than to be doing it in person. And one quick example, right? If you've experienced the sticky notes where, write one idea and we're going to brainstorm, we're going to put it up on the wall, we're going to organize our thoughts. That's a really fun activity to do in person. But it's actually 10 times better to do that on Zoom because, one, people can write things anonymously. Everyone knows whose handwriting is whose. So even though these are not, I'm not saying the ideas out loud, everybody knows which ideas I wrote. Secondly, you have an instant record of the ideas that were written. Nobody has to now take all of those sticky notes and decipher other people's handwriting. You can do all kinds of voting when it's online like this. There's just a million things that you can do that are so much easier virtually than in person. So while in person is great for the relational stuff, let's not say all Zoom meetings are bad.
Yeah, no, I actually now work at Atlassian, which is, we're a fully distributed company. So we actually have Zoom meetings 99% of the time, unless it's like a very specific in-person gathering, which is only a couple of times a year. So to your point, I think for me, when I'm learning tips about running a meeting, I almost always default to it being virtually, because even if you are hybrid, not a fully remote company, you're probably distributed. Your client is not going to necessarily come into your office. So to your point, unless you really have to, I think we're all defaulting to more virtual online meetings, just for the nature of the distributed work that we do in this whole world. So yeah, that's a really good point. And also you brought up some good points about there's actually a lot of benefits to that too. We can use the technology to make it easier. So when you were talking about times to meet, you were saying just having a discussion doesn't really require a meeting. I always think of if one person is doing 90% of the talking, do you really need to have a meeting, right? That's more like a lecture. What are some other tips on kind of you can filter through in your brain of questions of okay, do I need to put a time on people's calendar and set up the Zoom meeting, or should I just send an email, or should I just, at Atlassian, we really love this tool, Loom. If you guys haven't heard of it, it's amazing, where you can just record your screen and you talking, and then they can watch it whenever they want. So I'm a huge fan of that. But when do you decide, okay, I'm going to put the calendar invite on versus not?
Well, it starts with, what are we trying to accomplish in this meeting? If you don't know what you're trying to accomplish, then that's the first thing you have to figure out, right? If you're thinking, well, we're going to have a discussion about the client problem. Okay, but at the end of the meeting, what's the outcome of that discussion? We call it the desired outcome. So you really need to know what your desired outcome is. Is it a list of potential solutions for that client? And so you're going to have some ideas you're going to take to them. Is it a decision on what you're going to do to solve that problem? Is it a list of, are you just trying to gather information from people so that you're trying to just get some shared understanding of what the problem really is all about. So once you know exactly what that outcome is, then you can think about, well, who do I need to be getting this information from, or who needs to be part of this discussion to get us to that outcome? And then what's the best way to get to that outcome? Is it a meeting, right? Is it bringing the people together so that we can hear from everybody all at once and we're all getting on the same page? Or is it through an email and sending out a kind of, here's the situation, we're going to have a little discussion over email or over chat or sending a video to people, right? One of the reasons that doing one-way communication isn't great in a meeting is because it requires everyone to be spending that same time together. And that's super inconvenient. You're spending an hour of everyone's time. And that's not always the best case. You might actually be better off, especially if you were doing something like, I'm really trying to understand what's going on with this client. I'm going to go have 5 individual conversations. So I'm going to take 15 minutes from my 5 colleagues so I can hear from them. What do they see? That's only 15 minutes from each colleague. If I brought them all together to a meeting, it would be an hour and 15 minutes of their time together to like really hear that same level of information. That's like so much wasted time for each of them. So there are all these different ways that we can think about it, but really it comes down to is really, do you know what you're trying to accomplish in the meeting? What's the desired outcome? Who needs to be there in order to get to that outcome, or whose participation do you need? And then what's the best mode or method or format to get to that outcome? And if a meeting is it, then great, schedule a meeting. But there might be some other options that aren't meetings that can still get you there and be much more efficient.
Right. No, I completely agree. I mean, not everything has to be a meeting, and this is the exact kind of like filter that you can run through to decide if it, and you know what, when you are a person who's really good at deciphering when it should be a meeting and when it shouldn't, it's such an important trait, and people love people who do not waste their time. They love people who are efficient and productive. And so whether you know it or not, you're basically showing off this leadership skill that's incredibly valuable in the workplace and really builds a lot of influence, because people will be like, oh, she runs great meetings and they're totally worth going to, or has all these other methods to get information to us. And I really appreciate it, because it's like what we don't want is to default to, okay, I just won't communicate this thing because it requires a meeting. And so you need to have more tools in your toolbox when it comes to how are you going to communicate. Okay, so something that I hear all the time is, just create a meeting agenda. Not all agendas are created equal. So talk about what makes a good meeting agenda. Like, what should you have on there? How do you present it? All kind of the best practices with that.
Yes. Okay. So again, we're going to start with that desired outcome, answer the question at the end of this meeting, what will we have accomplished? Once you know exactly what that outcome is, you can build your agenda to lead you to that outcome. So I always suggest that you reserve the first 3 to 5 minutes and the last 5 minutes for your welcoming and your concluding. So during your welcoming, you're going to do things like remind people what the desired outcome is. It's an amazing thing, right? Our brains are going a million miles a minute, and we enter a meeting. And if you don't tell people this is what we're trying to accomplish today, everyone will have their own idea of what you're trying to do. And so your conversation will wander and you'll end up kind of off track, and people get frustrated or they won't be as engaged. So you want your welcome to start with, this is why we're here. This is what we're trying to accomplish. A quick review of the agenda if you have a plan for what you're going to do. Nice if you have time for a check-in and get everybody's voice in the room, because research has shown that if you talk early in a meeting, you're more likely to talk again. So get everyone to say hello and share something. And then we're going to get into the meat in a second. And then we always want to end with our wrap up, which is a review of what decisions did we make? What are our next steps? Who's doing what by when? So that people take ownership over actually going and doing those things.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also a fan of, so again, not to bring it all back to what I've been doing now, but I just wrote a document about, there's a kind of like the research that we used at Atlassian called page-led meeting. It's kind of, if you guys have ever heard of the famous Amazon 6-page memo. The Amazon is sort of famous for the way it ran meetings, but and I'll link to this page-led meeting document in the show notes, because essentially it's like a one-pager as like an agenda, and like you can come up with your own agenda template. You can find them in Microsoft. Like they'll give you like whatever helps you start with, kind of like a template to work off of. But one of the practices or behaviors around the Amazon one, Atlassian's one, these people who are like studying how to run good meetings, is they always include a pre-read time, which I actually really love. And so if you guys have never heard of a pre-read, it's essentially giving people the first 5 minutes also to just read the document. You can't assume that everyone has looked at your agenda ahead of time. And so giving people 5 minutes to do that, then you can assume everyone has read that information. So I also think that too is like a really good practice. If you're going to spend the time making a really detailed agenda, to your point, kind of outlining, this is my desired outcome. Also give them time to review it, and don't ask them to do it ahead of time. I think that's just, it's a good wish, but we can't assume that, right? Have you ever heard of the pre-read practice?
I have, and I actually disagree with this practice.
Oh, okay.
I think if this is your team's culture, of course, like better to do this than nothing at all, for sure. I also believe that like the time that we have in meetings is really precious. And so to spend it all sitting and reading, for me, is not a good use of everyone's time in that way. And secondly, we all process information differently. So we're not actually going to get the best thinking in the room if we're only giving people 5 minutes to consume something and then asking them to immediately react. For some people, that is how their brain works, and they are going to jump right in because it's super fresh. And for other people, they're not going to have their best thoughts until 24 to 48 hours later. And we're going to miss out on that. So what I really recommend teams do is create your pre-materials, whatever it is, a presentation. You can record yourself as an audio or video message, sharing information. You can have it in written format. You can do whatever you want. Send it to folks ahead of time, give them a couple of days, send them a reminder, auto schedule an email reminder to do it, and then start your meeting with the assumption that everyone has done it. And if you do this consistently and you tell people, this is how I run my meetings, I expect you to have listened to this, read it, right? I'm being respectful of your time. I expect you to show up prepared for my meetings. People will do it. They will add it to their task list. They will prioritize it because you have made it part of how you lead meetings. And if you were doing a good job with your meetings and you're sending them valuable pre-work, it will just become another thing they do in their day. It takes a little bit of gusto to be able to do that as a meeting leader, but it's the same thing I tell people about starting on time. You do not need to wait for everyone to show up. Give them a 2-minute window, and then you start meetings on time, because you are wasting the time you have with everyone else if you are waiting for someone. So unless that person is super essential and has to be there, start the meeting and people will learn to show up on time to your meetings because you are respectful of their time and you start on time.
Yeah, I completely agree. Okay, so let's kind of rapid fire. What are other best practices? Like I've heard of the parking lot, where it's like if someone brings up a topic that has nothing to do with what you're talking about, instead of letting them go on their 15-minute diatribe, you say, we're going to parking lot this, right? And you write it down somewhere else. So what are some other quick best practices to keep in mind?
All right, so first, going to the agenda piece of it, we didn't even talk about how to build out your internal part of the agenda. So I'll say for that really quickly is to think about what you want to do with your time with people, because it doesn't just have to be discussion, right? There are all different kinds of activities that we can do that make the meeting more engaging, that get more voices in the room. So when you're building your agenda, think about what are you going to do at that time? Do you want people to do a brainstorm with sticky notes? Do you want them to go round robin and share something? Do you want to just have an open discussion? And then design the agenda with time of like, we're going to spend 10 minutes doing this and 15 minutes doing that. And then that agenda, this is the quick tip here, right? Which is have the agenda in front of you. You don't have to share it with everybody, but if you have that in front of you and you've written on it from 10:05 to 10:25, we're going to do this. Now you can be keeping an eye on the clock, and that will help you stay on track, because you didn't just write, we're going to spend 10 minutes on this. You wrote 10:15 to 10:25. And now I can actually keep my meeting. I can keep an eye on where we're at in a way that's much easier as I'm facilitating. The second piece of that is it is okay to interrupt people and say, I'm so sorry to interrupt. We are kind of ending the time on this topic. I just want to make sure, has anyone else who hasn't spoken yet want to share something that hasn't yet been said before we move on, right? You can actually facilitate the meeting, but you can't do that if you don't have an agenda and you don't know what your timings are and you don't know what your activities are. So that's like just a very easy thing that takes some of these skills, like they take a little bit of willingness to try something new and different, but it makes a big difference. Okay. So
Yeah.
one more quick tip I'll give you right here, which is your desired outcome is your best friend, right? This is the thing that you can use when someone brings something off topic. You can ask if you don't feel comfortable with just saying this topic doesn't feel relevant, right? You can say, that's such an interesting point you make. I'm having trouble seeing how it connects to the desired outcome we have for today. Is it okay if I put a pin in that and we pick it up at the end of the meeting if we have time, or I follow up with this separately, right? It is like this desired outcome just becomes the way that you can help move a conversation forward to get you to the outcome that you want.
What about, I mean, this brings up a good point. What about assigning like roles? Like you're the note taker so that if someone brings something up that isn't relevant, like somebody's like, you're like, hey, if that happens, so and so, can you write that down? Like, do you like the assigning roles to people, or is that sort of as a facilitator being a little too, I don't know, treating your power a little too strongly?
So I used to talk all about different ways of having roles, rotating roles, randomly picking roles, all kinds of stuff, volunteering for roles. Now I find that technology can do a lot of that for us. And so we don't even need to. So having a note taker, I think is actually a not good practice anymore. And I've actually believed this for a long time because it's very hard to pay attention to the conversation, to take good notes, and to contribute yourself. So instead, what I used to tell
Right.
teams, so if you're not going to use an AI tool, what I used to tell teams to do, and I still recommend, is everyone should be taking personal notes for themselves. And then at the end of the meeting during your wrap up, that's when you go around and you collectively build the notes and you do it immediately into whatever kind of digital system you have. So at the end of the meeting is when you get to say, okay, who has any parking lot items or bike rack or back burner items that we want to hold on to? And everyone should have been taking their own notes. And so at that point, someone in the group will have said, oh, that thing that Mamie mentioned, that needs to get followed up on. Great. Okay. And what are the next steps? Who's going to do what by when? Right. And people will volunteer and say, well, I heard us say blah, blah, blah. Can someone do that? Right. And you collectively build it. Much better than one person trying to capture it all.
Almost like you're collectively building like these are our next steps, because that's the other argument is that we went
Mhm.
to a meeting and I still have no idea what we're doing. So how do you make sure people leave the meeting with their like quote assignments, they've approved, it's official that they've approved something, because oftentimes meetings just beget more meetings. So what's the kind of wrap up to make sure there's some final conclusion and decisions made, right? Like things are moving forward.
Yes. So that's the last 5 minutes of your meeting. You have to write that on the agenda so that you don't forget to move to conclusion and have the time to do the wrap up where you get to say, all right, what are the next steps? And write them down in a collective place, whether that's in your task system or on a digital document or into an email that gets immediately shared with everybody. You want to get it into a digital system as soon as possible. Don't waste more time after the meeting trying to type up all your notes. Just do it in the meeting. So that's the big thing, is at the end, getting people to all say, this is what we're going to do. Because we have a lot of, well, someone should do this and it would be nice if we did that. And oh, yeah, that's a great idea. That should get done. But then no one does it.
Right.
So you have to have time at the end of the meeting for every single person to say, here's what I'm committed to doing. And sometimes, by the way, a task needs to be assigned to somebody who wasn't in the meeting. So if that's the case, ask for someone to be the point person to connect with that individual and bring them up to speed on what's going on and make sure they understand the task that they've been assigned, right? Sometimes it's the meeting leader. Oh, yeah, I'll follow up with so and so and make sure they do that. But sometimes there's someone else in the room who might be better suited. So if the person who's going to do the task isn't in the room, figure out who is going to be the one to connect with that person so that it can still move forward.
Yeah, and this just kind of goes back to your earlier point about why technology is your friend. Technology, AI tools will take notes and summarize complete meetings for you. They'll give you timestamps if you want to where someone talked about whatever, so you don't have to try to remember every single thing. And you can use a digital collaboration document where everyone has access and can see what's being written down, right? So your agenda can live there, and then together you guys can write your notes. I mean, what I think is really interesting also about technology is like, compared to the old days, is those documents can live on, right? They can almost serve as like these artifacts of like, what was said in that meeting? What was our decision? So that you don't fall into this place of like, oh, I don't know if we're actually supposed to move forward with this. I mean, again, we're just trying to, take that 12 hours of weekly meetings down to like too. And I don't see any reason why we can't do that. Okay, last question is, what does it do for your career advancement and sort of, personal career brand to be good at running meetings? Like, why is this a skill worth investing in and putting it, because to your point, it is a muscle that you have to build, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think there are really three things. So not in any priority order at all. But one is people like working for good bosses, right? So you get more out of your team when they like working for you. And if you are running good meetings, that is just one more reason that your team is going to enjoy working with you and for you. And you're going to get the best out of them in those conversations if you're leading good meetings. And that's a great thing in general and also good for your career. So that's the first. The second is if you're leading good meetings, it means that you're not wasting time, which means that you're going to have more capacity and your team is going to have more capacity to do more things. And that is great. And then third is if you're leading good meetings, you are giving a gift to every other person in your team of what good leadership looks like and helping them go off and lead good meetings if and when they are in those roles, right? And so in terms of the kinds of impact that leaders have, right? We are not just impacting ourselves, we're not just impacting our team members, but we're impacting everyone we work with, right? Beyond that. So if your meetings are leading to good outcomes and those outcomes are getting pushed out into other teams or other departments, all of that is a reflection of the work that you're doing. And that is only a good thing. And most likely, you're going to have meetings with people who aren't just your team. You're going to have meetings with your boss. You're going to have meetings with colleagues in other departments. You're going to have meetings with clients. And all of that is going to reflect positively on you and those relationships that you're building with those people. So there's only good that can come from learning how to have good meetings.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like your tips, and I feel like what we're trying to basically do is sort of change meeting culture, right? Like there's the pre-COVID meeting culture, and now there's this new version of meeting culture, and we have this technology and these practices and these specific tips that you're sharing. Like we know so much more, and so it's almost like it's going to take work to sort of change how we work. But how if we can change how we're doing the work, we're going to work better and more efficiently. And some of the things that are leading to extreme burnout, a la meetings that happen all day and then you have no time to get your work. I think that's like the common complaint. It's like, well, we're not just going to end that by having agendas, right? It's the behaviors around that and kind of how you consider what needs to be a meeting, what not. How are you going to start maybe utilizing async forms of communication, email, Slack messages, scheduled emails, Looms, other video messages, whatever it is, like just having more tools in the toolbox, I feel like, versus, I mean, because we are distributed now. We're not all working on the same floor in the office where, your 10 o'clock meeting all the time. I think these are fantastic tips. And I know you have so many more tips for, management and leadership in general, which you don't have to be a manager to be a leader. So maybe remind everyone where they can find you, learn more about your work and get more tips, because these are really, really valuable.
Awesome. Yes. And we didn't even talk about all the things that you can do as a participant in meetings, but
I
there's a
know.
ton of stuff that you can do to help actually facilitate a meeting as a participant. So I talk about some of this stuff on my website and things, but also I have a book called Momentum: Creating Effective, Engaging, and Enjoyable Meetings. And that is for everyone, not just meeting leaders. And that is available on Amazon and all the places. You can check out my website, Meteor, Meeteor.com, for more meeting resources. And of course, the Modern Manager podcast and my YouTube channel, also the Modern Manager, tons more resources on all things related to being an effective manager, meetings, and beyond.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you. I'll put all those resources in the show notes. Thank you, Mamie.
Thank you so much. This was such a fun conversation.